This week on Theater Talk.
And he fired me. But he didn't fire me exactly, because what happened was he came over to me and he said, look, it's not working out. Would you like to leave?
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm the show's producer, Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
There is an absolutely marvelous, and I mean that term from the bottom of my heart, new book out about the public theater and Joseph Papp, the man who literally invented the not-for-profit movement in this city and throughout the country.
The book is called Free for All, Joe Papp, the Public and the Greatest Theater Story Ever Told. It is an oral history of the public theater that has been put together by Kenneth Turan, who is the film critic for the Los Angeles Times and on Morning Edition on NPR.
That's right.
Ken, welcome to Theater Talk.
Good to be here.
And someone who was instrumental in Joe's life and the public theater for many, many years, Bernard Gersten, who is the executive producer at Lincoln Center Theater, is here with us. He is throughout this book. Welcome to Theater Talk.
Thank you, Michael.
How many years with Joe at the public?
How many years was I?
Yes.
18, I believe.
18. And we also brought along with us Jerry Stiller, who was at the public from the beginning, doing productions with Joe, touring the boroughs of the city.
That's right. We went out on a flatbed truck that opened up into a stage, and we went out to all the boroughs, and we did Two Gentlemen of Verona, Romeo and Juliet, and what they call the Scottish play. And I was, it was my first shot in the park, which was something great because I'd just been at Stratford, Connecticut, where I worked with major stars like Jack Palance and Raymond Massey, Chris Plummer, and Fritz Weaver. Now I was coming down into the parks. And I was coming down from a big salary of $125 to $35 a week, and I got the job because Joe came up to me and said, you do Shakespeare good, and I said, I don't get enough money for $35. I have a wife. And he said, okay, we'll hire her too. She can play Julia in Two Gentlemen, and that's how we got started.
And that's how Stilla and Mira, your wife, got started. Well, welcome to Theater Talk, Jerry.
Thank you.
Ken, you began this book in 86 or 87.
Right.
Joe Papp hired you to conduct an oral history. How come it's taken 20-some years for it to come out? What happened?
Well, that's a good question. Initially, Joe read the book and was not happy with some of the things in it, though frankly we never had a very detailed discussion. I really don't know what specifically.
He didn't say, I'm unhappy the way you portrayed me or the way what people said about me?
No, he was just unhappy, and you know, this book had taken so much out of me. The work was so difficult. It was almost like I went into shock. I don't really have a memory of what went on, but he decided the project could not go on, and then he died. And it took years and years and years for me to be able to just deal with the project. Then I got in touch with Gail Merrifield Papp, his widow, and we talked about the book. And we came to the conclusion that the book, in fact, should go on, and that's what's happened.
Bertie, you knew him so well. Why do you think he would have, reacted negatively to this oral history that he commissioned? What people said about him? Would his ego have been damaged? Why would he have just dumped the project?
I don't really know the answer, so I can only speculate, and we can all speculate individually to whatever purpose that would serve. But I suspect he didn't think the book was sufficiently complimentary or didn't reflect him in his real situation as he really was, some degree of that.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, you knew him pretty well. Do you think he had a sort of a thin skin about some of the difficult things that people said about him? His reign?
No, he wasn't afraid of opening his mouth about anything. He was kind of a guy who would say what was going on, and he had a mission. And the mission was bigger than anything that anyone thought about him or what anybody would put a tenor on it. He wanted to give Shakespeare to the people of New York City. It came out of the fact that at the time he was being blacklisted, literally, by the networks. Mm-hmm. He had nowhere to go with his life. He decided to go out and take this piece of grass, which was essentially what Central Park was at that time, this particular place, and decided to do Shakespeare for the people. Then he enlisted all these actors who were out of work at the time, and he put the shows on. But the kind of the consequences which happen, like in every story, everything turns into a bad side and a good side. Why did he do it? What was he trying to do? Was it ego? Was it anything else? So stories were written, and he himself propagated some of the things, because he did some crazy things, Joe did.
Yes.
I mean, needless to say, Ann and myself, who were part of all of this, remember so many things. I mean, I was hired and fired by Joe, and then rehired by Joe.
In the space of...
In the space of a very few years. I mean, I remember doing The Second Murderer in Richard III. George Scott was playing that role of Richard, and I got fired because I couldn't get along with the first murderer. And then,
when murderers fall out, they tell that.
Well, it was a real story. I got such wonderful notices, and people were contributing money to Joe Papp and the theater. The Chock full of Nuts people were doing it, and I had done Lawrence with the dog, and the man from Chock full of Nuts.
Chock full of Nuts.
Well, that company's gone.
He contributed like something like $25,000 because of the dog. It really established me in a big way. People would come up to me and say, "By thy dog thou shalt be known." So the dog was the thing that propagated it. Then he fired me. But he didn't fire me exactly, because what happened was he came over to me and he said, "Look, it's not working out. Would you like to leave?" So, I mean, he had a kind of a sensitivity to the way he dealt with things.
Yeah,
but from there on in, my life with Joe continued.
Let me ask you, Ken, when Jerry says this vision, this overriding vision of creating a free Shakespeare in New York, what was behind that? I mean, what in his childhood, his youth, his psychology drove him to push that vision so relentlessly?
Well, I really think, I mean, that's why I deal with it in the book. I really think he had a really impoverished childhood, the kind of childhood where the family would leave in the middle of the night because they couldn't afford to keep paying the rent. And this really kind of pushed him to really, then he discovered Shakespeare, and he kind of fell in love with it. And this was like the deepest part of him, this belief that everyone could like Shakespeare, everyone could be saved by Shakespeare the way he was. This could not be more sincere. This was the core of what he believed.
And everyone should see it for free.
Yeah. Everyone loved it. You couldn't see it for free. You couldn't afford it.
Hello. Michael, would you undertake to sell tickets for Shakespeare in the East River Amphitheater during the summer? And how much would you sell them for, and how many customers would you get?
Exactly. It had to be free.
And what would your marketing budget be?
As he gets more successful, as the public theater and Shakespeare Festival becomes so important, it seems to me that the ego grows. Or was the ego always there? Was the relish of power, having the power, always there? Or does it grow as the theater grows?
Well, Bernie, you knew him for such a long span.
I think that a discussion of Joe's ego can't fit within the confines of the program. Not because the ego is so large. It's not that. It's that it's very complex. And what happens to an individual, a talented, able individual, who does fight against tremendous odds and establishes a cultural icon, because that's what it is, in a tough city like New York, where if you can make it anywhere. Mm-hmm. And how that all happened and what happened to Joe in the process. My earliest memory of Joe is driving down Sunset Boulevard in a 1948 convertible Chevy, and what do you call it? Going door to door canvassing for Henry Wallace in '48, singing labor songs all the way. Those were the early years, and there was no ego involved.
And then?
Well, after a chorus line, it was a different picture.
Yes. Well, he then becomes Mr. Broadway, doesn't he, at some point, Ken? I mean, he's got more Tony Awards than anyone else.
Not more than Hal Prince.
I mean, it always feels to me that the core of him remained the same. I mean, a lot of the trappings were different. But I mean, his passion for theater and his passion for what he believed in for theater, I think that always stayed there. Other things would change, but I never felt, I mean, again, I didn't know him for this whole period, but it felt that the core remained the same with him, even though peripheral stuff maybe was different.
Jerry, go ahead.
Can I just add to what's being said about his ego and whatever, how it affected. First of all, he was on a mission that was the feeling. I always felt he was someone more like a shaman than he was a producer, you know.
More like a shamus.
No, shaman. That's a Nordic type god. They threw the glyphs out, and we picked up the glyphs, and today we're going to do much ado about nothing, stuff of that nature. But the part that we all are aware of the dynamicism and his belief and his thrusting himself into it, we miss some of the moments that I myself, I can tell you that I experienced. There were moments when I could not believe I was standing there watching Anne rehearsing Romeo and Juliet on a balcony, and Joe came over to me. He put his arm next to me. He said, "My son has AIDS." I had no idea where that came from. Why me? Why was he telling me? I said, I wanted to ask, was I the only one the first one he told about it? I have no idea.
He did find out his son had AIDS, and he found out that he had cancer himself at about the time your book was completed, didn't he?
Right, yeah.
So perhaps that influenced his decision to not want such a personal book published at that time.
I mean,
it was just too raw.
I would think so. I mean, I don't have any way of knowing, but my speculation is,
Yes,
that was a factor.
It's interesting what you say, going back to this, that we had the discussion about the ego, but something that comes off in the book is he can fire a director 1 minute and then run over to a struggling writer and slip him $100 so he doesn't have to go back to his job. I mean, he did have incredible generosity.
There was no contradiction in those two things.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the contradictions that exist in every human being.
Yeah.
But Joe was tremendously generous and tremendously overbearing in certain respects. There's no question about that.
Interesting. Take us back, if you will, to those early performances in the park when you're first doing it for, the working class people of New York, which is what Joe wanted. A lot of the kids were amusing in the audience at that time.
Oh yeah, well, we did Romeo and Juliet. I remember in Corlier's Park down on Lower East Side, and it was most of the audience was basically Hispanic. Kids were coming in, all ages, and then they were doing Romeo and Juliet, and then comes that moment where Romeo says, "Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?" Juliet saying that, and then Romeo responds back, and then one of the kids says, "Give it to Romeo, give it to good." That was the kind of audience we had.
But Joe would have loved that. I mean, that was the point of it all, was it not?
That was exactly what he was trying to do, bring it to the people and create that. But the idea of working in the park, where one of the things he fought for dressing rooms for the actors, I remember that. We all were dressing in the restrooms with the patrons who were coming to see the show, you know. So finally he was able to get some money to establish not even dressing rooms. We had sheets that separate us on clotheslines, and now we were below the rocks, and now people were peeking in at the women changing. So then they got the cops up there to get rid of these people. Then the cops were peeking in, and there was all kinds of crazy things happening there. But at the end of the night, we all would leave the park together. And at that time, there were a lot of problems in the park. And I remember there were a lot of racial type stuff, where we had a couple of Asian people in the company, and we'd all leave together because we were trying to fight our way out of the park at night sometimes. And there we were. We became a band of, I call them ragamuffins or whatever it is. And we got so close that on Sundays, I remember Colleen Dewhurst and my pals with Eddie Sharon and George Scott, and
all of whom come back to life in this book.
I had a car. I had like a '54 Plymouth. It was a Chrysler, and we'd go to Reese Park together in the car on Sundays when we weren't doing anything, and picnic together.
That Shakespeare, those early productions, were also breakthrough in that. I remember you say in your book that Papp said, "Why can't people say Shakespeare in a normal way? Why did they have to speak in such an arch way?" And that this brought forward a new kind of Shakespearean aesthetic, which was very controversial.
Well, it grew out of a series of things. First of all, before there was Shakespeare in the Park, there was the Shakespeare Workshop, which Joe conducted at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church. And that was basically a project for actors who wanted to be able to speak Shakespeare and to find an American style, not with a view to producing plays, but just to examine Shakespeare and what would happen if American actors spoke American speech, standard American speech, and not fake British accents because they were dealing with Shakespeare. And that was a movement that very much originated with the New York Shakespeare Festival because it was not true in Stratford, Connecticut, where there was a certain aping of the British style.
I want to ask you, the seminal moment in his life in establishing the Shakespeare Festival is this titanic battle he has with Robert Moses, who then was the Parks Commissioner, and I mean maybe the most powerful man in New York State, more powerful than the governor perhaps. If you can just sketch in that little bit of a history for us.
You know, Robert Moses, for whatever reason, decided that it was not right not to charge. That the city needed money and that Joe should have money and Shakespeare, there should be a fee. And Joe just felt the whole core of his thing was that, no, it should be free, or else how are people going to come to it? Why are people, the kind of people that he wanted to see it, wouldn't come if it wasn't free. Mm-hmm. So he just said, no, I don't want to do it, and it ended up in court. And again, the whole notion, I mean, as you say, Robert Moses was the most powerful man in New York. A lot of the city that exists today exists because of his vision. Mm-hmm. And no one ever thought about going up against him. But Joe just, when he believed in something, he believed in it. And he said, no, this is wrong. I'm not going to allow an admission. That went to court. And, Joe got a lot of support in the press while this battle was going on, and the courts ruled in his favor.
One of the interesting things in that battle with Moses that I think Joe figures out, and I want to ask you about this because you were around his relationship with the press, he knew how to get the press on his side, use the press, manipulate the press, but then also if he got a bad review, he'd call up Clive Barnes and scream at him. I mean,
they were different moments, historic moments to begin with. That getting the press on his side was because it was a David-Goliath situation.
Yeah.
Who gets the press? David, all the time.
Yeah.
And Joe made a very, very excellent David-like figure.
But can you imagine on an opening night, which this happened with the Boom Boom Room,
I was
producer,
there, I can imagine it.
Tell us what happened.
Tell us what happened with Clive Barnes.
And this, we should say, is when now Joe Papp is no longer the other underdog. He's the Goliath. He's Joe Papp.
Well, he's not the Goliath, because at the point that you open a season at Lincoln Center Theater, at that place, at that time, a very, very difficult and frequently failed theater prior to the Shakespeare Festival getting there, the opening play by his surrogate son, David Rabe, and a play that Joe esteemed and fired the director of and took over the direction of, and when Clive's review came in, or he heard it over the phone, and he of course called up Clive and said, "You can't do this."
He didn't put it that politely.
He said, "I'm going to bleep. I would like to bleep you."
You think you're going to bleep me? I'm going to bleep you.
to the head critic of the New York Times.
Bleep?
Yes, bleep.
If we publish this in the New Yorker, we can say the original word.
That's true.
Well, we're PBS here.
So, but that's the man, though. I mean, the fighter is always there.
Always there.
Well, fighting to get Brooks Atkinson to go to the East River Amphitheater, that was one fight. And fighting to, drive Clive Barnes out of office was another fight.
Yeah. But the fighting comes from...
There's a wonderful line in the book that I really like. I forget who said it, a director who worked with Joe. He said, when you fight your way out of the ghetto, you're never sure you're completely out. And I think this is really one of the dynamics of Joe's life, is that he did fight himself out of terrible poverty. And I think, as this person said, you never lose that fighting, that feeling that you need to be fighting.
Right.
Now, Bernard, you worked with Joe Papp for 18 years. You were devoted lieutenant and helped him build the public theater. And then you left.
He fired me. What do you mean I left?
Yes.
Didn't he say you can leave?
No. He said, in that case, you're fired. He said, you have to resign. I said, I won't resign. He said, then I have to fire you. I said, yeah, you have to fire me. He said, you're fired.
See how? But it was done in dribs and drabs.
But did this come as a complete surprise to you, or had there been indications to you before?
There were indications
before.
What
was that?
Yeah.
Wasn't there something that told you?
There was a sense that I had, and I remember feeling it very strongly one night backstage at the Delacorte during the play, which was the last play in my time there, which was All's Well That Ends Well, that Joe was requiring so much territory that there was no turf left for me. And my feeling backstage that night, which I still remember very vividly, is there was no room at the Shakespeare Festival for me to stand. There was no room, and I suspected that the end was nigh.
Were actors scared of him?
No, he was. He was very, in a way, he was very gentle with actors. I mean, I remember doing a play, doing Hurly Burly once, which was way after all of this was going on, and I thought I did terrible one night. And he came back and he said, I said, I was terrible tonight, Joe. He said, no, you did good. So there was a certain kind of I think, empathy for actors. I think he himself wanted to be an actor. The actors came back and played many, many roles. I mean, Charlie Durning played many times. Kevin Kline, I'll never forget. I'll tell you the love that people had for that theater. Kevin Kline used to come in Much Ado at 6 o'clock to start his warm-up. Mm-hmm. And then one day he came over to me and says, would you like to help me paint the dressing rooms? I said, what? We're actors. We've got things to do here. We're doing shows. And I said, no, I can't do it. I'm getting ready to do the thing. But here he was painting the dressing rooms, swabbing him down. That's the kind of thing that he had with actors, which were very, I think, very close in some, because he had a feeling, I think he himself wanted to be one. He could have been one. He wasn't one. But his big fight, of course, as we have been talking about, was with the establishment. And I think at one point the establishment caught on to him and started supporting him, these corporates or whoever they were, because he was the most visible way that they could get publicity. That they now had a guy who could give them the visibility as being, hey, we're helping the city, we're helping the country, we're helping the arts, because Joe Papp was able to, I don't know, savor them or hug them or do something with them. And so he saved all of us.
Was he ever seduced by the corporations or the foundations or the money when it came in? Because there's a line where he says about the Schuberts, who produced Chorus Line on Broadway with him, that, you know, you do it for me.
Just a minute. Who produced Chorus Line on Broadway?
All right. The Shakespeare Festival. I'm sorry.
That's right.
I'm sorry.
It was a delusion of the Schuberts that they produced.
To this day, that delusion persists, I must say.
Well, but it's a delusion.
But
get out an old playbill and see who produced it.
But is it? Do you believe him when he says, you know, I can do the line for me, the Shylock
Walk
line?
with you and talk with you, but I will not pray with you.
Do you think he was true to that?
From my point of view, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I just felt that he was not interested in that other stuff. I mean, it just didn't concern him. I mean, he didn't live ostentatiously. He wanted to be putting on plays. I mean, he was just driven to do that. I
just want to ask you each, a lot of the people in this book are dead, and this book brings them back to vivid life. Who was the best performance or the most memorable performance that you saw someone give in Shakespeare in the Park back in the day? Well,
I would have to think of George Scott doing Richard III, but there were so many other.
But just what was the impact that performance had on you, George Scott?
Well, I'll tell you what the greatest performance that I was part of was Two Gentlemen of Verona, the musical version, in which at the end of the show that dealt with the Vietnam War, and the music by Galt McDermott and John Ware. At the end of the show, there was such a spectacular feeling that connected between the audience and the actors that when the show ended, the people in the audience got up on stage and danced with the actors. And I never will forget that. It was one of the most thrilling moments of my life. As far as George goes, having done Audrey, and doing Audrey and I doing Willem and that, the two low comics, he did Jaques, and George Scott was being involved in a bridge game downstairs playing bridge. He hear his cue, he'd drop his cards, go upstairs, do the 7 Ages of Man, finish the thing, there was applause, he'd come down and pick up the cards and start playing again. I never saw such a...
and for you, a performance, an actor who will
George Scott is Shylock.
Why?
Well, it was a brilliant performance and a really marvelous production. And it was a challenge production. But that's the single individual performance. And for a play, which play was our favorite or my favorite? It was Much Ado About Nothing.
Why?
Because it was a wonderfully realized production by A.J. Antoon with Sam Waterston and Kathleen Widdows. It was just extraordinary. And it was the one that moved to Broadway subsequently and was taped by NBC for network television.
Interesting.
All the above.
And you were in New York, Ken, so do you remember a particular...
Well, the one that I always think of is the one that both of, again, I think of the George C. Scott thing. This is the one at the top of my list of the performances I wish I'd seen. Because the people who talk about his Richard III, I mean, decades later, they almost can't even describe it. The impact was so extraordinary. And also, I read the story in the book about he would come out. I used to be part of these junior, not at that specifically, but I went to New York high school, visits to theaters, and the rowdiest things imaginable. And George would come out in these things, and he would just come out, and everyone would get quiet. He didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to do anything. His presence, the strength of that presence just really, it made the least receptive audience in the world receptive. So I wish I could have seen that.
Yeah, and Papp must have loved it, I'm sure. Okay, the book is Free for All, Joe Papp, The Public and the Greatest Theater Story Ever Told, an oral history of the public theater, put together by Kenneth Turan from the Los Angeles Times. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Jerry Stiller, actor, writer, comedian, married to the great Anne Meara, and an early public theater Shakespeare performer. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Bernard Gersten, the executive producer of Lincoln Center, and for 18 years, the man who sort of made the trains run on time at the public theater for Joe Papp.
Unfortunately, they were running under the theater.
Very good. Thank you for your time, all. Thank you.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Alan S. Gordon Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.